In a town wrapped in snow and silence, where grief settled like frost on every window pane, a dog lay between life and death and chose to fight. This is not just a story of survival, it's a story of how a single heartbeat can thaw a frozen world, how loyalty can outlast silence, and how three lost souls found each other again when all hope seemed buried beneath the ice. Let the story unfold, and if it finds a quiet place in you, like it did in them, remember to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes that love, even at the edge of goodbye, can choose to stay. The snow and willow pines fell like a hush across the land, soft but relentless, blanketing the mountain town in thick layers of white silence. It was late December, and the northern wind from the Rockies howled through pine branches like forgotten songs of sorrow. The town, tucked between frozen woods and misty hills, was small enough that no streetlight flickered without everyone knowing by morning. In a weathered log cabin at the edge of town, nearly swallowed by the forest and the storm, lived Thomas Carter, a man whose life had grown as quiet and cold as the season that surrounded him. Thomas was 68, tall but slightly stooped, with silver hair that curled at the nape and eyes the color of storm clouds, pale gray, distant and weary. His hands bore the roughness of decades spent in fire and smoke. He had once been the town's most trusted firefighter, a local hero until the day flames took more than he could fight, his wife, Mary Ann. Since then, Thomas had lived alone in that aging cabin, avoiding conversation beyond necessity. People in town often said he was a kind man turned inward by grief, polite but unreachable, and they were mostly right. But Thomas was not completely alone. He shared his days with a companion more faithful than words could express. Ranger, a German shepherd with grizzled black and tan fur, and a once proud frame now grown frail. Ranger was 11, old by shepherd standards, but his eyes still followed Thomas with the alertness of younger years. Once, they had served side by side in the department's now retired K-9 unit, rescuing hikers and braving brush fires, always a team. These days, they mostly shared silence, warmth, and the slow ache of growing old together. This winter, though, something shifted. Ranger stopped eating. At first, Thomas chalked it up to age. The old boy didn't run like he used to, didn't bark at deer on the edge of the woods anymore. But then he started refusing even his favorite food. His breaths became shallow. His eyes stayed closed longer than they stayed open. And worst of all, the tail that had once wagged at the creak of Thomas's boots now lay motionless on the cabin floor. On the third day of this steady decline, Thomas sat beside the fire, watching Ranger shiver in his sleep, and knew with a sinking certainty it was time to say goodbye. That morning, the snow was knee-deep and still falling. Thomas wrapped Ranger in the thick blue quilt Mary Ann had sewn their first winter in the cabin. Lifting the dog gently into his arms, he felt the heartbreaking lightness of a body that had lost strength. Ranger stirred faintly, pressing his muzzle to Thomas's chest with the ghost of a sigh. Thomas didn't speak. There was nothing to say that Ranger hadn't heard in every walk they'd taken, every quiet evening they'd shared. The veterinary clinic sat on the southern edge of town, a squat building with a red roof nearly invisible beneath the snow. Its single porch light was on, flickering softly in the storm. Thomas parked the truck outside and carried Ranger through the front door, the bell above the frame giving a tired chime. Inside, the clinic smelled of antiseptic and pine-scented cleaner. The waiting room was empty, just a row of worn plastic chairs and a bulletin board full of missing pets and thank you notes. A young receptionist, maybe in her 20s, stood behind the counter. She had auburn hair pulled into a messy bun, and eyes that widened when she saw the bundle in Thomas's arms. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she said gently, recognizing him instantly. Her name tag read, Jenna. "Doctor, Morgan's ready for you. She's expecting you." Claire Morgan had arrived in Willow Pines just 2 months prior, taking over after the town's longtime vet retired to Arizona. Claire was in her early 30s, tall and lean, with pale skin that flushed easily in the cold, and eyes the soft green of spring moss, though those eyes rarely met others directly. She moved with a quiet intensity, methodical and calm, as if her thoughts always hummed just beneath the surface. Claire had left behind a busy animal hospital in Chicago under unclear circumstances, something people in town only whispered about, but everyone agreed she was brilliant, if a little distant. She met Thomas in the examination room, dressed in a thick gray cardigan under her lab coat, sleeves pushed to her elbows. She had the habit of rubbing the edge of her thumb against her forefinger when nervous, habit that returned the moment she saw Ranger. Her face softened. "Let me take a look," she said quietly, gesturing toward the steel table covered in a flannel blanket. Thomas lay Ranger down, as gently as if placing a child to sleep. "I think this is it," he said, voice low and rough. "He hasn't eaten. He barely breathes. He's tired." Claire said nothing at first. She placed a stethoscope against Ranger's chest and listened. She examined his gums, his pulse, the moisture in his eyes. She took her time, every motion precise and calm. Finally, she looked up at Thomas. "He's weak, very. But let me keep him overnight for fluids. We can reassess tomorrow." Thomas hesitated. "I don't want him suffering." "He's not in pain right now," Claire assured, her voice steadier than she felt. "And if this is the end, he deserves comfort, not a rush. Will you let me try?" There was something in the way she said try, something personal. Thomas gave a slow nod. "One night," he said. Claire nodded. "We'll make him as comfortable as possible." As Claire and Jenna prepared an IV line in the back, Thomas sat in the waiting room once more, snow dripping from his coat. The wind outside howled against the windows, but inside was only silence. Thomas looked at his hands calloused, scarred, shaking slightly. He thought about all the fires he had fought and how none of them prepared him for this quiet ending. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to remember. The sound of paws on hardwood. The nudge of a nose under his hand. A world that, for a time, had felt less empty. The chapter closed not with a goodbye, but with a stillness. Ranger lay under gentle heat in the back room, eyes fluttering but not yet gone, and Claire stood beside him longer than necessary, her fingers resting softly on the graying fur, as if trying to feel some answer in the quiet. Night fell early in Willow Pines. By 5 p.m., the mountains dissolved into a wall of darkness, and the town's lights blinked on one by one, like soft lanterns against the snowdrifts. Inside the Pine Creek Veterinary Clinic, the world was hushed but awake. Machines hummed gently in the treatment room, casting pale green glows across the tiled floor. A small space heater ticked quietly in the corner, barely keeping up with the cold that crept through the old building's seams. Claire Morgan sat alone on a stool beside the treatment table, her back straight but her fingers fidgeting in her lap. Ranger lay still beneath a heated blanket, his breaths thin and uneven. An IV drip ran into his front leg, delivering fluids and electrolytes at a slow, steady pace. His body twitched occasionally, as if dreaming, but Claire wasn't sure if it was dreaming or slipping. She watched the rise and fall of his ribcage like a metronome. Every beat was a conversation she didn't want to end. Claire was 32, with sharp cheekbones and a jawline that hinted at stubbornness. Her hair, a muted chestnut, was always tied back in a tight braid like a no-nonsense rope. Most people in Willow Pines still saw her as the new vet, quiet and competent but distant. She wore plain clothes under her coat-dark jeans, hiking boots, and a forest green sweater with sleeves rolled to the elbow, revealing thin wrists and a small scar near the base of her thumb. That scar had a story. Most things about Claire did, but no one in town had heard it. She'd arrived in Willow Pines just 2 months ago, answering a classified ad for a full-time veterinarian in a town most city dwellers had never heard of. She said she wanted quieter skies, slower days. But the truth, which she hadn't even told herself yet, was that she'd been running from the relentless buzz of Chicago, from the whispers at her old clinic, and most of all, from the memory of a dog named Baxter. Baxter had been a border collie with a spinal injury. Claire had overseen his treatment. She'd pushed for surgery. The owners hesitated. The dog declined. And in a moment of exhausted frustration, Claire had told them it was too late, that he wouldn't recover. 2 days later, another vet in the practice tried an aggressive course of antibiotics and anti-inflammatories. Baxter walked again. He lived another year. The clients wrote glowing reviews for the other vet. Claire's license remained clean, but her heart never did. That was the day she stopped trusting her instincts. And maybe, in some ways, herself. Now, as she looked at Ranger old, fragile, but with something unspoken still flickering in those cloudy eyes, Claire felt the weight of that memory press into her sternum like a cold hand. She stood, walked slowly to the counter, and retrieved a stethoscope. The quiet click of her boots echoed softly. She leaned over Ranger again, listening closely. His heartbeat was irregular but present, not failing. Not yet. She scribbled notes into the chart, then circled something twice. At that moment, the back door creaked open, and a gust of snow followed a woman inside. "Sorry I'm late," said the voice, slightly out of breath. The woman was Mara Jensen, the clinic's night technician. She was in her early 40s, short and sturdy, with a wide frame and a halo of frizzy blonde curls that never stayed in her scrubs cap. Mara had grown up in Willow Pines and had known every dog, cat, goat, and squirrel within 20 miles. She was warm, if a little nosy, and had the kind of bark laugh that echoed down hallways. "You're not on tonight," Claire said, surprised. "I know," Mara replied, shrugging off her coat. "But Jenna told me about the old shepherd. I had a feeling you'd stay late." She walked over and gently brushed the side of Ranger's neck with a gloved finger. "He's a handsome old fella." "He's fighting," Claire said quietly. Mara looked at Claire for a long second, then nodded. "So are you." They worked in silence for a while. Claire rechecked vitals. Mara prepared a batch of warmed, wet food, though they both knew Ranger likely wouldn't touch it. Still, the room felt less heavy with another person inside. Around 10 o'clock, Mara brewed 2 mugs of tea in the break room and handed one to Claire. They sat on opposite sides of the staff table. Snow tapped gently at the windows. "You never talk much about where you came from," Mara said, not unkindly. "That by choice?" Claire gave a small smile. "Some of it." "You see a lot in this job," Mara continued. "Takes a toll. Hardest part's not the medicine. It's deciding when not to use it." Claire looked down into her tea. "I made the wrong call once," she admitted. "Didn't think the dog would make it. Told the family it was hopeless. Turned out it wasn't. They forgave me, but I didn't." Mara didn't respond for a while. Then she said, "You stayed here tonight. That means something." Claire didn't reply, but she didn't look away either. Just after midnight, Mara stepped out to her truck for something, and Claire returned to the treatment room. Ranger hadn't moved. She sat beside him again, gently stroking his ear. "Ranger," she whispered, "I know you're tired, but if there's anything left in you, anything at all, I'm listening." As if in answer, the old dog's ear twitched. Then, slowly, his tail gave a faint, tired thump against the blanket. Claire leaned in, holding her breath. His eyes didn't open, but there was life still there, just beneath the surface. Claire stood up quickly. She adjusted the IV. She pulled out her stethoscope again, and she whispered, "Not tonight. Not yet." Outside, the wind moaned down from the mountains like a ghost. Inside, for the first time in months, Claire Morgan felt the weight of her past begin to lift. Not all at once, but like a door slowly cracking open. And Ranger, wrapped in warmth and memory, kept breathing through the night. Morning came slowly to Willow Pines, bleeding into the white sky with no sunlight. Only an ashen glow that barely separated earth from cloud. The storm had eased, but not left. The trees outside the Pine Creek Veterinary Clinic drooped under the weight of fresh snow, and everything was blanketed in a silence that felt sacred. Inside the treatment room, the world narrowed to one room, one table, one breath at a time. Thomas Carter returned to the clinic just after sunrise. He hadn't slept. He hadn't changed. His flannel jacket still carried the scent of wood smoke and wet fur, and the bags under his eyes looked carved from stone. His boots tracked snow onto the linoleum floor, unnoticed. In his arms, he carried Ranger, who had grown even lighter overnight, but whose shallow breathing had persisted against all odds. The quilt Marianne once made was wrapped carefully around the old dog, as if it could preserve what was already fading. Claire Morgan met him at the doorway. Her eyes were red-rimmed but alert. She'd slept in the clinic overnight, though slept might be too generous a word, for the hours she spent seated beside Ranger, monitoring vitals, whispering soft encouragements no one else heard. Now she stepped forward and reached to support the bundle in Thomas's arms. "Morning," she said softly. "Come in." Thomas gave a small nod. He had never been a man of many words, but now even his breath was held hostage by emotion. He followed her into the examination room, where the heat lamps were already on, the table covered with fresh flannel. He laid Ranger down gently, then stood back, hands clenched at his sides. Claire placed a stethoscope to Ranger's chest again, listening. A long moment passed. Then she exhaled, her brow furrowed. "He's weaker," she murmured. "The vitals are still irregular, and his temperature dropped again during the night." Thomas swallowed hard. "Then, that's it." She didn't answer. Instead, she turned to the counter and reached for the small vial she'd prepared earlier, clear liquid, nearly invisible in its cold precision. She held it in her palm, weighing it not just with science, but with something heavier. Behind them, the door creaked open again. Jenna, the young receptionist with auburn hair and a heart too big for her role, peeked in. She'd come in early, knowing this was the morning. When she saw Ranger on the table and Thomas standing beside him, her expression softened with preemptive grief. She stepped in and stood silently near the door, not wanting to interrupt. Claire moved slowly, preparing the syringe with practiced hands. Yet every click, every shift of motion seemed louder than it should have been. The sound of the needle drawing liquid was the only thing that moved in the room. Thomas stepped forward and rested his hand on Ranger's neck. "I'm so sorry, old friend," he whispered. "You've been braver than anyone I've ever known." His voice cracked, his hand trembled. Ranger didn't lift his head, but there was a flicker in his eyes, something raw, searching, tired, but not yet gone. And then, with a slowness that felt eternal, Ranger lifted one paw, then the other. His legs were weak and trembling, but he managed to place them delicately, deliberately around Thomas's neck. A hush fell over the room. Jenna gasped quietly. Claire froze. It was not a reflex, not a muscle spasm. It was an embrace. Thomas bowed his head into Ranger's fur, his breath catching against the coarse hairs of the dog's neck. Tears fell silently, soaking into the blanket. "You're still here?" he murmured, as if in disbelief. "Still fighting?" Claire's hand hovered in midair, the needle ready but unmoving. She looked at the two of them, man and dog, and something inside her shifted. A pressure that had coiled around her chest for years seemed to loosen. Then she heard it. A sound, barely perceptible. She leaned in, stethoscope pressed to Ranger's chest again. Her brows drew together. She adjusted the angle, listened again, then her eyes snapped open, her voice sharp and immediate. "Stop." The room stilled even more, if that were possible. Claire set the syringe back on the tray and pressed her palm gently to Ranger's side. She closed her eyes, counted silently. His heart, though uneven, was not fading. It was steadying. Fighting. "I'm not doing this," she said firmly. "Something's changed." Thomas lifted his head, confused, hopeful. "What are you saying?" "His heartbeat isn't collapsing," Claire replied, reaching quickly for her tablet. "It's erratic, but stronger than yesterday. And this response, this movement, it's not the body shutting down, it's the opposite." Jenna stepped forward. "Do you want me to call Mara?" "Not yet," Claire said. "I need to check his temperature again, and blood pressure." She moved quickly now, clinical and confident. The earlier doubt had been overtaken by instinct, an instinct she had spent too long suppressing. She placed a thermometer, recorded the reading, and nodded to herself. "It's still low," she said, "but not catastrophically, and not what I'd expect if it were multi-organ failure." Thomas stared, barely breathing. "So, what's happening?" Claire paused before answering. "I'm not sure, but I'm not convinced this is just old age anymore. There might be something else. An underlying infection, maybe. A systemic inflammatory response. Whatever it is, it's not time. Not yet." She turned to Jenna. "Page Mara. Tell her to bring the mobile ultrasound and prep broad-spectrum antibiotics." Jenna nodded and slipped out the door, moving with purpose. Thomas looked down at Ranger, whose paws still rested gently against his chest. "You stubborn mutt," he whispered with a hoarse laugh. "You really weren't saying goodbye, were you?" Claire returned with a fluid bag and began adjusting the IV line. Her expression had changed, not softer, but resolved. The woman who once doubted her instincts now leaned into them, letting them guide her hand. Ranger stirred slightly, his head tipping ever so faintly toward the sound of Thomas's voice. And just like that, the moment shifted from a farewell to a reprieve, from grief to possibility. Outside, the snow had stopped. The trees still held their burden of white, but the wind had calmed, and the sky above willow pines took on the pale blue of beginnings. The storm had passed overnight, leaving the town of Willow Pines swaddled in a thick, unbroken sheet of snow. Morning light crept in slowly, filtered through gray clouds that still loomed heavy over the valley. The pine trees surrounding the Pine Creek Veterinary Clinic sagged under the weight of fresh powder, their branches frozen in solemn prayer. Inside the clinic, it was quiet but tense, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Claire Morgan stood alone in the treatment room, her stethoscope resting against Ranger's chest, her eyes closed, brow furrowed in concentration. Outside, cars rumbled softly along snow-packed streets, but in this room, all sound faded beneath the rhythm of one fragile heartbeat. The dog beneath her hand was a shadow of the creature he had once been. Ranger, 11 years old, once the fearless companion of a fireman, now lay beneath a heated blanket, his tan and black fur dulled by time and illness. His breathing was shallow, uneven, and his once vibrant eyes had dulled into a misty gray. Yet there was something in his body's refusal to let go, something quiet, but unmistakably alive. Claire opened her eyes. She stepped back and pulled a stool close to the examination table. Her jaw was tight, her mind spinning. She had stayed late before. She had watched patients die before. But this wasn't the same. Something didn't line up. She reached for Ranger's chart, her fingers swift but precise. The paper file had been compiled hastily previous vaccines, a routine checkup from nearly 2 years ago, and handwritten notes from yesterday's intake. She turned the page and began cross-referencing the numbers. Temperature, pulse, respiratory rate. Then she glanced at the blood work Jenna had faxed in from the nearby lab just before sunrise. The white blood cell count was elevated, significantly. Claire blinked and read it again. Then again. She felt her stomach twist. Sepsis. Or at least the early signs of it, not the quiet shutting down of an old body. This was a systemic battle, and if caught early enough, sometimes, just sometimes. She stood abruptly and crossed the room to the supply cabinet. Her hands moved quickly now, driven by instinct. She grabbed a fresh IV line, a bag of warmed saline, and 2 vials of antibiotics broad spectrum, fast-acting. She laid them on the tray and began assembling them, her mind locked in the rhythm of action. That was when the door opened, and Thomas Carter stepped inside. He looked older this morning, though perhaps it was only the weight of hope. His tall frame still carried the strength of a man who'd once pulled bodies from burning buildings, but now his shoulders sagged beneath the pressure of waiting. His snow-damp boots squeaked on the tile, and his worn canvas coat hung loose around him. "How is he?" he asked, voice low, hoarse from a night spent awake. Claire didn't look up immediately. "Still with us?" Thomas approached the table slowly, his eyes never leaving the dog. "He hasn't moved much. He doesn't have the energy," Claire said, her tone clipped, focused. "But that doesn't mean he's giving up." Thomas glanced at the equipment Claire was preparing. "You're doing something different." Claire paused, then nodded. "I don't think this is just old age," she said carefully. "There are signs pointing towards severe infection, possibly sepsis." Thomas blinked. "Infection?" "Yes. The blood work white cells are through the roof. His temperature is low, but not in the way we see with organ failure, more like shock response." The old man stepped back, digesting the words slowly. "What does that mean?" Claire met his gaze, steady and calm. "It means we have a chance, a small one, but a real one." He looked down at Ranger. "You're sure?" "No," she said honestly, "but I'm sure enough to try." Thomas gave a faint, almost imperceptible nod. Claire returned to her work. She inserted a fresh catheter, hung the IV, and began the first of the antibiotic injections. The silence was broken only by the soft beeping of the heart monitor and the whisper of saline running through the line. Time stretched. Thomas remained at the edge of the room, leaning against the counter, arms folded. His eyes rarely left Ranger, and his expression was unreadable, somewhere between hope and mourning, stuck in the limbo where both lived. As the IV drip began to work its way through Ranger's system, Claire finally allowed herself to sit again. She pulled the stool closer, brushing a hand gently over the dog's head. "You're stubborn," she whispered. "I like that." A few minutes later, the door creaked open again, and Mara Jensen entered, rubbing her gloved hands together. She wore her usual navy scrubs, and her curly blonde hair was pulled back into a bun that had already started to fray. She raised her eyebrows at the sight of the IV bag. "You called me in for a fight?" she said. Claire smiled faintly. "Looks like it." Mara stepped closer, eyes scanning Ranger's body, then the monitor. "Vitals?" "Unstable but holding. Temps climbing slowly." Mara nodded approvingly. "You going in with metronidazole?" "Started with cefotaxime. We'll add metro if the GI signs worsen." Mara let out a breath. "Well, damn. This old boy might not be finished after all." Claire looked toward Thomas, who stood silent as ever. "He never said goodbye," she murmured. "Not once." Thomas's voice, when it came, was quiet. "He's always been that way, loyal to the very last breath." For the next hour, they worked in tandem. Mara assisted with monitoring vitals, while Claire documented the evolving signs. Ranger's heart rate remained erratic, but stronger. His gums, once pale and dry, were regaining color. His tail didn't move, but his ears twitched when Thomas spoke. By the time the town's church bell struck 11 in the distance, Claire finally leaned back and allowed herself a full breath. "We're not out of the woods," she said, "but we've got ground beneath us again." Thomas walked closer and knelt beside the table. He touched Ranger's paw, and for a second it felt warm, alive. The edge of goodbye had dulled. He whispered, "You keep fighting, boy. I'll be right here." And Ranger, without lifting his head, let out the faintest sigh in return. The wind howled outside the Pine Creek Veterinary Clinic, curling around the eaves and windows like a restless spirit. The town of Willow Pines lay shrouded in a cloak of moonlit snow. The streets hushed, the forest beyond, unmoving under the weight of ice. The hour was past midnight, but the world refused to sleep. Inside the clinic, two souls sat in parallel solitude, one in a waiting room, wrapped in quiet grief, and one in a treatment room, grasping at hope with trembling hands. Thomas Carter hadn't moved from his seat near the hallway since Claire had closed the door hours ago. He sat hunched forward, elbows on his knees, hands clenched tightly around the old leather collar that once belonged to Ranger. The collar was cracked and worn, the brass nameplate dulled by time. Ranger, partner and friend. His thumb ran over the letters again and again, as if doing so might tether his dog to this world for just a while longer. His face bore the shadows of age and fatigue. At 68, Thomas had once been a tower of strength in this community, a firefighter, a rescuer, a husband. But after Marianne's passing, his world had shrunk to the corners of his cabin and the silent companionship of the dog who never left his side. Ranger had seen Thomas through panic attacks, bitter winters, lonely holidays. He was more than a pet. He was the last thread Thomas had to a life that once felt full. Thomas stared at the hallway floor, unmoving, the silence of the building pressed against his chest. He had fought wildfires that roared like freight trains and carried children out of burning houses, but nothing had prepared him for the stillness of waiting while a friend drifted toward the end. In the treatment room down the hall, Claire Morgan worked with the quiet focus of someone walking a tightrope over water, too dark to see the bottom. Her gloved hands moved carefully as she adjusted the flow rate on the IV. The fluids were warm now, thanks to a makeshift water bath Mara had rigged earlier. Ranger lay beneath a soft fleece blanket, his body small and sunken, but still breathing. Claire's hair was tied back in the same braid she had worn since morning, though loose strands now curled against her cheek. Her forest green sweater bore faint smudges from hours at the table, and her eyes, though ringed with fatigue, burned with a steady light. She had been through long nights before, but not like this. Not since Baxter. It wasn't just about saving a dog. It never had been. This was about redemption, about not making the same mistake again, about trusting her own instinct even after it had once failed her so deeply. Baxter's name still echoed in her thoughts when she wasn't careful, a border collie with sharp eyes and a tremble in his spine, a decision made too quickly, a second chance missed by inches, and the guilt. God, the guilt had followed her from Chicago like a shadow she could never outrun. She stepped back from the table and rubbed her temples. The heart monitor beeped softly. Still unstable, but stronger than earlier. Ranger's tail had not wagged again, but his ears occasionally twitched when she spoke to him. His breathing, though labored, had rhythm. She scribbled notes onto his chart. HR, irregular but tolerable. CRT improved, possible early antibiotic response, continue fluids. The door eased open behind her. Mara Jensen stepped inside, holding 2 mugs of strong black coffee. Her frizzy blonde curls were tucked under a wool beanie now, and her cheeks were flushed from the cold. She offered 1 mug to Claire and gave a sideways glance toward Ranger. "How's our miracle case?" Claire took the coffee with a quiet nod. "Still with us? That counts." Mara moved to the table, examining the equipment. "Temp? 99.2, Claire said. Up from 97.6. "Okay," Mara murmured, the trace of a smile touching her lips. "Not dancing yet, but he's trying." Mara had always been a grounding presence. Her no-nonsense attitude masked a deep well of empathy, especially for the animals who fought when they weren't supposed to. She didn't ask questions about Claire's past. She just showed up when she was needed, like tonight. They stood in silence for a moment, sipping coffee, listening to the beeping machine and the faint hiss of the IV. Then Claire broke it. "You ever feel like one case could undo everything you've ever doubted in yourself?" Mara raised an eyebrow. "I think if you don't feel that sometimes, you're in the wrong profession." Claire chuckled under her breath. "I keep thinking if I hadn't waited, if I'd acted sooner." "But you didn't," Mara said firmly. "And you're acting now. That's what counts. We don't always get second chances. But when we do, we fight like hell." Claire stared at Ranger. "He's fighting harder than any dog I've ever seen." Mara stepped back. "Then so will we." A few minutes later, Mara left to check on the front office, and Claire was alone again. She reached down, resting a hand lightly on Ranger's paw. "You're not alone in this," she said softly. "You've got someone waiting for you, and I think he needs you more than he knows how to say." She looked over at the clock. Nearly 2 a.m. In the hallway, Thomas still sat, still holding the collar. He leaned back against the wall now, his eyes closed, but sleep never came. Instead, he saw flickers of memory behind his lids. Ranger as a pup, chasing pine cones through the yard. Ranger barking at the first snowfall of their second winter in the cabin. Ranger curling beside him on the porch after Marianne's funeral, not asking questions, just staying. That was the thing about dogs. They didn't try to fix the broken things. They just laid beside them until the pieces were ready to mend. The clinic lights dimmed to their nighttime settings. Outside, the snow resumed, soft and thin, more whisper than storm. A calm, fragile hush covered the town. And inside, 3 hearts kept beating, a man clinging to the past, a woman healing from it, and a dog who refused to stop loving either of them. The sun broke over willow pines with a pale, reluctant light, filtered through silver clouds and the crystal-laced breath of the forest. The snowfall had slowed to a whisper, delicate flakes drifting in spirals like ash from a forgotten fire. Outside the Pine Creek Veterinary Clinic, the world remained hushed and frostbound, but inside, something quiet and warm was stirring, fragile, persistent, and impossible to ignore. Claire Morgan stood by the window of the treatment room, her arms folded across her chest, watching Ranger with steady, watchful eyes. It had been nearly 6 hours since his IV line was started, since the antibiotics began their silent battle beneath his grizzled fur. Her coffee had long since gone cold. Her hair was messier now, strands falling over her temple, and the shadows beneath her eyes had deepened. But there was a kind of light in her posture, a stillness that wasn't resignation, but patience. On the table, Ranger stirred. It was subtle at first. A twitch of a paw, a small huff through his nostrils. Then, slowly, the lids of his tired eyes lifted, revealing a clouded amber gaze. He blinked once, as though reacquainting himself with the world. His breathing remained labored but consistent. The machines around him beeped softly in rhythm, no longer struggling to keep up with chaos, but marking something more, even more possible. Claire stepped forward and knelt beside the table. She gently placed her hand on Ranger's neck and whispered, "Hey, there you are." Ranger's eyes moved, following her voice. His tail gave a weak thump against the blanket, just once. But it was enough. Claire's chest tightened, and she leaned over, forehead nearly touching his. "You're not done, are you?" she said, voice breaking just slightly. "You stubborn, beautiful boy." She stood up quickly and turned toward the hallway. She didn't walk. She moved with the kind of purpose that carried the weight of miracles. At the front desk, Jenna had just arrived for her morning shift. cheeks flushed from the cold, her long auburn hair tucked beneath a knit cap. Claire barely slowed as she passed. "Can you let Mr. Carter know? Tell him he should come back. Now." Jenna blinked, then beamed. "Yes, ma'am." Thomas Carter had gone home briefly just before dawn, at Claire's insistence. He hadn't wanted to leave, but she'd seen the way he sat slumped in the hallway, skin pale and hands trembling from exhaustion. "Just go wash your face," she'd said gently. "Get 10 minutes of sleep. I promise to call if anything changes." He had nodded, reluctantly, and driven back to his cabin through the dark, silent snow. Now, he returned within 20 minutes, stepping into the clinic, still wearing the same heavy coat and worn boots. His face was raw from the wind, but his eyes searched the space with sharp desperation. Claire met him near the door. Her face, so often unreadable, had softened into something almost luminous. "He's awake," she said simply. Thomas's throat worked to form a sound, but none came. He nodded once, then followed her down the hall without a word. The treatment room was quiet, filled with the soft hum of machines and the slow inhale and exhale of breath. Thomas stepped to the table and stopped. His hands trembled as he reached forward. Ranger's eyes found his immediately, and that same tired tail gave another thump. "You old fool," Thomas whispered. "You're really still in there." He rested his hand on the dog's cheek, and Ranger leaned into the touch. No bark, no whine, but there was understanding recognition, the kind that didn't need sound to speak volumes. Behind them, Claire gave them space, retreating to the far wall to check the vitals again. A few moments later, the door opened and Mara entered, shrugging off her parka and brushing snow from her beanie. Her curls stuck out at odd angles, and she carried a paper bag in one hand. "I brought food," she said to Claire. "For you, not the dog." Claire cracked a tired smile. "You're the only person I know who remembers humans need to eat during emergencies." "I'm the only person you know who watches you forget," Mara replied with a snort. Then she glanced toward Thomas and Ranger and paused. Her tone shifted. "Well, I'll be damned." "Looks like we might be writing up a recovery," Claire murmured. Mara placed the bag on the counter and approached the table. She examined the monitors, then leaned over to gently stroke the fur between Ranger's ears. "Welcome back, handsome. You gave us a hell of a scare." Thomas sat down slowly on the small bench by the wall, never removing his hand from Ranger's body. "They always said dogs had 9 lives," he murmured, "but this one just used 10. Jenna peeked in, holding a clipboard and a wide smile. "Do you want me to call Dr. Linwood and cancel the transfer to the hospice clinic?" Claire nodded. "Yes, and schedule new labs for tomorrow morning. I want to track everything." Jenna disappeared, light-footed, almost humming. For the next hour, the treatment room became a place of quiet recalibration. Ranger rested but remained alert, his temperature stabilized, his breathing eased. Claire adjusted his fluid rate and began the second antibiotic dose. Mara brought Claire a sandwich and forced her to eat half before stealing the rest. Thomas barely moved, only leaning closer to whisper now and then into Ranger's ear. As the morning light crept across the windows, pale and silver, something shifted in the energy between Claire and Thomas. It was subtle, a glance exchanged, a shared breath of relief, but it was there. They had walked parallel paths for hours in the dark, and now, for the first time, their roads seemed to curve toward each other. It wasn't friendship yet, it wasn't trust, but it was something like understanding. "You did good," Thomas said quietly to Claire when Mara stepped out to make calls. Claire met his gaze, almost startled. "So did he." Thomas nodded, voice thick. "But he couldn't have done it alone." Claire looked away, her voice low. "None of us can." And Ranger, still weak, still healing, stretched his paw toward Thomas's knee and let it rest there, as if to say, "We're not finished." The snow had begun to melt in slow, reluctant trickles, forming crystalline veins along the gutters and fences of willow pines. The town, still shivering beneath the lingering cold, was stirring with the first signs of winter's retreat. At Pine Creek Veterinary Clinic, Ranger's recovery had become a quiet marvel, no grand declarations, no dramatic reversals, just the slow return of color to his gums, the strength in his breathing, and the steady flicker of his tail when Thomas entered the room. 3 days had passed since Ranger opened his eyes. He was still weak, but every morning brought some small milestone, lifting his head to drink, wagging his tail at the sound of Thomas's voice, blinking in recognition, when Claire whispered his name. The worst, they hoped, was behind him. Now, Claire stood in the gravel driveway of Thomas Carter's cabin, her boots crunching softly beneath her. It was late morning, and though the sun was hidden behind slate-colored clouds, the trees dripped with melting frost. The cabin sat at the edge of a pinewood hollow, its roof sagging slightly under years of weather, its porch blanketed in decades-old habits. A stack of firewood leaned against the wall, uneven and damp, and a tin mailbox hung crooked on a rusted nail. Claire wore a navy jacket zipped to the chin and dark jeans tucked into insulated boots. A clipboard was tucked under her arm. She looked up at the cabin's roofline, assessing it the same way she would a patient quietly, with an eye trained to see what others might miss. The door creaked open, and Thomas stepped out, pulling on a flannel overshirt. He looked more rested than he had all week, though the fatigue hadn't completely left his eyes. He held the door with one hand and gestured with the other. "Come in. It's not much, but it keeps the cold out." Inside, the cabin was simple and weathered, built by hand in the 70s, with knotty pine walls and a fireplace of stacked river stones. The living room flowed into a tiny kitchen, where a kettle hissed gently on the stove. The air smelled of wood smoke and coffee, with a faint trace of old books and something more earthy like damp soil. Ranger's bed, now empty, sat near the fire. A worn-out toy, a rope knot, frayed to near extinction, lay beside it like a memory. Claire smiled faintly as she took it in. "I'm here to take a look at the environment," she said, setting her clipboard on the small dining table. "Just want to make sure we're not missing anything that could have caused the infection." Thomas nodded, moving with the unhurried caution of someone who'd built a life out of silence. "Whatever you need." She walked the perimeter of the cabin, examining vents, corners, bowls, and bedding. Everything was clean, if old. Then she asked, "Where do you get your water?" Thomas motioned toward the back. "Well, out by the edge of the woods. Old pump system. Was here before me." Claire followed him through the rear door and into a yard overrun by wild growth and snowmelt. The pump stood crooked beneath a lean-to shed, rust crawling up its sides like ivy. Claire knelt beside it and opened the access panel, her fingers working with quick precision. "Mind if I take a water sample?" she asked. "Course not. Never had a problem with it before," Thomas replied, frowning slightly. "That's the trouble with bacteria," Claire murmured. "It's polite until it isn't." She filled a sterile vial and capped it, slipping it into her field kit. Then she stood and looked around the clearing. The soil here was damp and dark. Old tree roots twisted beneath the surface like sleeping bones. She bent down, brushing her fingers through the earth. "Something wrong?" Thomas asked. "Maybe nothing," she said. "But this is low ground. If there's any contamination upstream animal waste, even a decaying carcass, it could leach into your supply." Thomas exhaled, guilt crawling across his face. "You think this is what made him sick?" "I think it's one piece of the puzzle," Claire said gently. "It would explain the infection and why it hit so fast." Inside, they sat at the table while she noted her findings. Thomas poured them both coffee in mismatched ceramic mugs, his hands surprisingly steady now. Claire sipped hers and glanced around the cabin again, her gaze softening. "This place," she said, "it's quiet, but it feels lived in. Not lonely?" Thomas chuckled dryly. "You're kinder than most." "I didn't say you weren't lonely," she replied. "Just that it doesn't live in the walls. You don't let it." He studied her then, for a long moment. "What about you? What do your walls say?" Claire hesitated. Then she set her mug down. "My walls are newer," she said. "Too clean. They echo more than they should." Thomas nodded. "Maybe that's why you came up here, to quiet the echo." She smiled, just barely. "Maybe." They worked in silence after that. Thomas helped her flush the water system, and Claire installed a basic filtration unit she had picked up from a local hardware store. She showed him how to maintain it, explained warning signs to look for. It was clinical, methodical, but beneath it, something warmer began to form. By late afternoon, she stood at the doorway, ready to return to the clinic. "He'll need another week of antibiotics," she said, "and maybe some time in the sun once this snow melts." "I'll see to it," Thomas replied. "He likes the east porch, sleeps in the light." Claire paused. "And you? You getting any rest?" Thomas gave her a look that carried both surprise and something else reluctant gratitude. "I'm trying," he said. "Having something to fight for again helps." Claire nodded, adjusting her scarf. "Funny how dogs do that to us." "Yeah," he said, watching the sky beyond the trees. "They remember the parts of us we forget." She didn't reply. She simply turned to leave, her boots crunching down the path, the wind tugging gently at her coat. Back inside the cabin, Thomas sat on the edge of Ranger's empty bed. He picked up the old rope toy, turning it in his hands, the frayed ends soft and worn. Then he looked toward the door, and for the first time in a long while, the quiet didn't feel so heavy. Snow had returned to Willow Pines, though now it came not as a storm, but as a soft, forgiving hush that blanketed the town in quiet beauty. The streets were still edged with ice, but the sun pushed gently through the gray clouds, casting a faint golden glow across rooftops and pine branches. In that quiet hour just past dawn, the world felt like it was beginning again, not loudly, not suddenly, but steadily. Inside Pine Creek Veterinary Clinic, the warmth of the treatment room stood in stark contrast to the chill outside. The soft hum of the heater filled the space as Claire Morgan leaned over the exam table, where a familiar shape had stirred awake for the first time that morning. Ranger, now a little steadier, a little stronger, lifted his head at the sound of approaching boots. His body, though still lean and fragile from the illness that had nearly taken him, held a different kind of weight now. Resilience. His coat, once dull and thin, was beginning to shine again in patches along his back. His amber eyes, still clouded with age, lit up when the door opened and a tall figure stepped inside. Thomas Carter stood in the doorway, wearing the same thick canvas coat he'd worn every day of the past week, dusted now with fine snow. He removed his gloves slowly, his fingers trembling not from cold, but from anticipation. "Hey, boy," he said softly. At the sound of his voice, Ranger lifted himself. Slowly, carefully, he pushed his front legs beneath him, found his footing, and stood, wobbling but upright. His tail wagged once, twice, then stronger, as though remembering how to express joy after a long time without it. Claire turned, crouched beside Ranger, and ran her hand gently down the dog's back. Her smile was bright, a warmth not just of relief, but of something deeper. The lines beneath her eyes had softened. The guarded stillness in her voice had been replaced by something freer. "He's stubborn," she said with a quiet laugh. "I like that." Thomas moved closer and knelt down beside her, resting a hand on Ranger's shoulder. "He's always been that way, never let go of anything he loved." Ranger leaned into the touch, resting his weight on Thomas's leg, as though the contact itself was the final confirmation that he had made it back. Claire looked up at Thomas, her voice low but certain. "You kept him going." Thomas shook his head slowly. "Number you did." But Claire only smiled. "I think Ranger's the one who reminded me not to give up." She reached down, her fingers brushing the leather collar, now back around the dog's neck, polished, repaired, and bearing his name once more. That morning, as the clinic filled with the soft clinks of medication trays being put away, Jenna wandered in with a cup of coffee for Claire and paused at the door, watching the scene quietly. She didn't speak, but the smile on her face was enough. Later that afternoon, Thomas stood outside the clinic's front doors, leash in hand. Ranger walked beside him slowly, one paw at a time, his body cautious but willing. The leash hung loose between them, not as restraint, but as connection. Claire stepped out to the porch to see them off, arms crossed lightly, scarf fluttering in the breeze. "Take it slow," she called out. Thomas turned his head and gave a rare, quiet smile. "We've got time now." They made their way down the street, the snow crunching gently beneath their boots and paws. Each step left a mark, each mark a testament. Ranger trotted a little ahead, then circled back, nudging Thomas's hand like he used to. Behind them, Claire lingered in the doorway, watching until they disappeared around the corner. Her hands were cold, but her chest was warm, filled with something that hadn't had a name in a long time. Maybe it was hope, maybe it was peace. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridgeline and the snow began to fall once more in soft spirals, Thomas and Ranger found themselves on the trail that ran along the eastern edge of town. It was a path they hadn't walked in nearly a year, not since Ranger's legs had begun to falter, and not since the grief had settled so heavily on Thomas's shoulders that he couldn't bear the silence. Now, the trees bowed around them like old sentinels, the snowfall catching in their branches like starlight. Ranger paused often, sniffing the ground, occasionally resting but always continuing. Thomas said little. He didn't need to. They reached the ridge where the view opened to the valley below. White hills, a frozen lake, and the faint thread of chimney smoke rising from scattered homes. Thomas knelt beside Ranger, pressing his forehead gently against the dog's neck. "You brought me back too," he whispered. Ranger leaned in, his tail brushing softly against the snow. Back at the clinic, Claire sat by the window in her small office, a cup of tea warming her palms. She looked out at the snow, then down at a drawing pinned beside her desk, a child's sketch of a German shepherd, clearly labeled Ranger, with a cape drawn around his back like a superhero. Jenna had said it was from a little boy who'd seen the dog on a walk and heard the story from a neighbor. Beneath the drawing were the words, "Don't give up. Heroes always come back." Claire smiled, and outside, under a sky filled with falling snow, three souls who had nearly forgotten how to move forward walked on, not toward an ending, but into something new. A soldier of a man, a healer of a woman, and a dog whose body had grown old, but whose loyalty refused to die. There was no need for goodbye, not anymore. The story reminds us that sometimes the smallest signs of life, a wagging tail, a whispered name, a step through the snow can, reignite hope we thought was gone forever. In everyday life, we all face moments when giving up seems easier. But, like Ranger, like Thomas, like Claire, choosing to stay, to try again, can lead us to something we didn't know we were still waiting for. If this story moved you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that not all goodbyes are final. And tell me in the comments, when was the last time you almost gave up but didn't?